The Part 5 notes will be on the flow of energy and nutrients throughout ecosystems. All organisms within an ecosystem require energy. Energy is needed for many cellular processes, including overall growth and maintenance for the organism, as well as reproduction. In order for organisms to have energy, we need some sort of initial input. The sun is the ultimate source of all energy. So we need to get the sun's energy into the ecosystem. How we do that is through our autotrophs, specifically the photoautotrophs. These organisms are producers because they use the sun's energy to produce their own food through carbon fixation in the Calvin cycle. We have been focusing on several categories of these types of photoautotrophs: plants, algae, and cyanobacteria. That's blue-green algae. After these organisms use the sun's energy to make glucose, for example, they're then going to use those glucose molecules to be able to build other molecules, or use the energy from those glucose molecules to make ATP so that it can use that ATP energy to build other molecules anabolically, such as their DNA, their proteins, complex carbohydrates, and so on. In organisms, or in ecosystems, entire energy budget is determined by the amount of photosynthesis that's actually occurring within that ecosystem. And this is going to vary by seasons and locations in the world. Previously, we've talked about the different biomes and how much sunlight each biome gets and things like that. Remember that closest to the equator, they experience almost no seasons because sunlight is so direct. They're going to have 12-hour days, 12-hour nights, and therefore it's incredibly stable. This type of ecosystem would have the largest energy budget because they're going to be able to have the most photosynthesis happening there. But again, it's going to vary within the different biomes. There's always exceptions to the rules, and so while the sun is the ultimate source of energy for most ecosystems, there are going to be rare exceptions. There are places where the sun cannot reach. For example, caves are very dark and they get no access to sunlight, or really deep in the ocean where the sun's rays cannot penetrate. This means there has to be other organisms there that can create energy for that ecosystem without using the sun. These types of organisms are called chemoautotrophs. They make their own food using energy from chemicals. They're going to use chemicals and oxidation reactions to create their carbon compounds. They're going to take reduced compounds. For example, it could be a reduced nitrogen compound, or could be a reduced sulfur containing compound, something like that. And they're going to take the electrons from that and then use those electrons in carbon fixation to make their glucose. Again, these are chemoautotrophs. These organisms not only exist in places where there is no sunlight, they can also exist in other locations together with photoautotrophs. So for example, in a forest ecosystem, there's going to be plenty of photoautotrophs creating energy using the sunlight, but within the soil where the sunlight doesn't hit, there's also going to be chemoautotrophs that make energy in an alternative way using the chemical compounds in the soil. So that's a really good example of a time where they're able to live together in the same location. Food chains. A food chain shows one pathway within an ecosystem which energy is transferred from organism to organism in a linear pathway. It is important for you to understand that energy only flows in one direction. So the sun enters the producers, they create that energy, the producers then transfer energy up the food chain, right? And so each organism will help to transfer that energy up the food chain. Energy only flows in one direction, comes in from the sun, moves through the food chain, ultimately is lost as heat. A food chain only shows one possible pathway within this particular ecosystem. Here's a couple examples of some more food chains. And so on the left, we have a terrestrial food chain. Plant transfers energy to the herbivore, transfers to a carnivore, transfers to the next carnivore, and up to the next carnivore. Notice the arrows point in one direction. They point in the direction of energy being transferred. They do not point in the direction of who is eating who. If we pointed that way and the insect was eating the flower, then the arrow would point the other way, and that would be wrong. So it's really important that you always have your arrows pointing in the direction that energy is being transferred to. And then on the right, we have a marine food chain. So moving up the levels, you can see they're all named here. We're starting with our primary producers. They produce their own energy. Primary consumers are going to be your herbivores. Secondary consumers eat the primary consumers. Tertiary, which always means third level, is going to eat the secondary consumers. And then sometimes there's a quaternary level where these quaternary consumers eat the tertiary consumers. Sometimes you may hear the term apex predator. If you do, it typically refers to the predator that's on the top of the food chain that does not have any other predators consuming it or going after it. It doesn't necessarily have to be a quaternary or tertiary consumer. It would depend on how many pathways there are within that particular food chain. So that's going to vary. When we talk about these different levels, we typically use these terms rather than apex predator, for example. But should you hear it, you should know what it means. A hawk is an apex predator because it doesn't really have any predators that eat it. One more example showing a food chain. Transferring energy from the sun and all the way through until it gets to the human who's eating the fish that they're fishing for. Notice in this particular image that the size of the arrows change. The arrows are fatter coming from the sun and they get smaller and smaller and smaller. This has to do with a rate of energy flow. IB is really big on these types of proportions. So if you see an image where it does show different sized arrows, they would expect for you to understand that that does show an overall difference in rate of energy flow. It won't always look like this, but if you see it, you are expected to know that. More energy is coming from the sun, less and less and less energy gets transferred as it moves through the food chain, and we'll talk about why in just a sec. Trophic levels show us the routes of energy flow and nutrient or chemical cycling. So when we look at the different trophic relationships, remember we're looking at where does the energy or chemical nutrient start and then where does it end, and looking at all those relationships all the way through to get it to the final end point. It always starts with producers. Typically, it's going to be photosynthetic producers or photoautotrophs, but remember it can be chemoautotrophs. Just depends on the situation. This is a really important level because it supports all levels above it that need to depend on these organisms for getting that initial energy source in the ecosystem. So plants, algae, and cyanobacteria are great examples of photoautotrophs, and then iron oxidizing bacteria would be a chemoautotroph. They typically are found in areas where there would be rust. Rust contains high levels of iron. So for example, in a rusty pipe, there may be bacteria that's growing inside of that rusty pipe, and that bacteria is able to take electrons or oxidize iron compounds and then use those high energy electrons to produce carbon compounds. The next level up is our primary consumers. Primary means first, so our first level of consumers. They are heterotrophs, all the consumers will be, and these are going to be your herbivores, so they specifically eat the plants. So any grazer that you could think of, like a zebra, a cow, those are good examples, or leaf-eating organisms, like a giraffe, or elephants are primary consumers. Snails tend to eat small plants or algae, so they would be good examples of a primary consumer as well. Secondary consumers are going to be your second level of consumer, and they are your first level of carnivores. They are going to eat the herbivores. So in the pictures we see a lion eating a zebra, so the zebra is a grazer. Therefore, in this example, the lion would be an example of a secondary consumer. In tertiary consumers, this is your next level of carnivores, so they are going to be carnivores that eat the level of carnivores below them. and tons of examples of this. So if we go back to our lion example, let's say the lion eats a hyena that eats the zebra, that eats the grass. Well, now the lion is a tertiary consumer. And other examples are listed up here as well. Then we have our decomposers. Decomposers are typically not included on most food chains because you would have to have arrows coming out of every organism because that's their job. They can gain energy from any organism that's detritus material or dead or decaying organism, something like that. So a zebra that has, been attacked by a lion is going to have leftover tissue on it, and these decomposers can help to break down that leftover tissue. But they would also do the same thing when the lion dies, but they're also going to break down the leaf matter that falls from the trees. That's the detritus material on the ground. And so, again, they're not typically on food chains, but they are very much so a part of these trophic relationships. We talked previously about two types of decomposers. Something that unites these decomposers, or all decomposers, is that their main job is to help recycle nutrients. So they return nutrients to the soil, and that enriches the soil so the plants have access to those nutrients. They do it differently though. Saprotrophs and tridivores are slightly different in how they do that process. Saprotrophs secrete enzymes outside of the organism itself, and those enzymes are going to break down or digest the dead or detritus material externally. Then they're going to kind of absorb or take in all the nutrients that they can use. Any nutrients that they cannot use remain in the soil for usage for the plants. Examples of saprotrophs include fungi, like mushrooms and molds, and bacteria. Detritivores, they digest internally, so they're going to bring in the dead or detritus material and digest it inside of them, and then eliminate any nutrients that they cannot use as waste, for example, as feces. And then that waste will go into the soil and enrich the soil with nutrients for the plants. Lots of examples of detritivores, so scavengers are good examples, such as crabs or shrimp are good. They're often found in fish tanks when people have fish tanks because they clean the tank, right? They eat the algae and kind of slow the growth of that. Roly-poly bugs, earthworms, cockroaches, lots of examples of detritivores. Typically, organisms will occupy more than one different trophic level, and so therefore you'd have to really be careful when discussing its trophic level that you refer to the specific food chain that you're talking about. So there's examples here. If the cricket eats the grass and then the owl eats the cricket, the owl is a secondary consumer. But if the cricket eats the grass and the rat eats the cricket and then the owl eats the rat, well, now the owl is a tertiary consumer. So they can be both, but it would depend on the specific food chain that you are focusing on. Food webs show the more complex pathways of feeding relationships within an ecosystem. There is typically not just one food source per organism. Typically, each type of organism has multiple things that it can consume. And so that would be shown in a food web. This is when you see all the arrows crossing each other because it's showing many food chains. Remember, a food chain is just one linear pathway, but a food web would show all the pathways, for example, within that ecosystem. And so this is when you can clearly see that organisms can belong to multiple trophic levels. Organisms, after they gain the carbon compounds, whether they make it themselves, if they're a producer, or they get it by consuming an organism, once they have those carbon compounds, they then need to use those carbon compounds to create energy. So they're going to send it to the mitochondria and break it down into ATP and heat. For this example, remember, about 40% of energy is actually converted into ATP, and the remaining 60% is lost as heat. And that heat is still important. It's used to, help warm the organism, for example, to maintain homeostasis. we need ATP for a lot of things. We need ATP for things such as making the large macromolecules. For example, in order to make DNA, in order to make RNA, make proteins, make cell membranes, ATP is used in that process. We need ATP for active transport. In BioH, we talked about endo and exocytosis. We talked about pumps, protein pumps in the membrane, like the sodium-potassium pump, or hydrogen pumps, which are proton pumps. They pump molecules from low concentration to high concentration, which does require energy. Movement within the cells. These could be vesicles that need to move around. These could be the chromosome movement in mitosis. These are all things that do require ATP energy. So even though an organism has all this energy inside of them, they typically use most of that energy for themselves, right, through cellular respiration. And so ultimately, they're going to use about 95 to 80% of that energy for themselves, which means only what's left over after that can potentially be passed on to the next trophic level. So on average, that's going to be about 5 to 20% that gets passed on to the next trophic level. The organism has already used a lot of that energy for itself. Once that energy is used for itself in cellular respiration, it is no longer able to be transferred to the next trophic level. So it does vary greatly within transferring within food chains. And so that's why there's that range of 5 to 20%. But each time energy is transferred to the next trophic level, that adds biomass to the next trophic level. Biomass is like the dry mass or dry weight of all the carbon compounds within the organism itself. We would have less and less biomass as we move up the food chain due to this transferring of energy being less and less as we go up. Again, because there's such a range, on average, we'll make an assumption of 10% on average of energy can be transferred from one trophic level to the next. That means the rest of it was already used up by the organism to make ATP and heat. Production refers to the accumulation of carbon compounds as biomass in ecosystems. And there's going to be different types of production. The units are typically something with a unit of mass, because it's biomass, and a unit of area, and then a unit of time. So it's usually something like grams per meter squared per year, something like that. It can change, and you'll be given a unit for these types of things, but you should have an understanding that why each particular portion is important. It's mass, so we need that unit of mass. It needs to be in a given area, a given space, so we do need that unit, and then we have to have a time frame as well. Biomass accumulates within trophic levels when organisms grow in size and also when they reproduce. And every biome is going to vary in their ability to accumulate biomass. Remember, at the equator, there's really high productivity. They're going to have a lot of photosynthesis, so they're going to accumulate a lot of biomass, and therefore all that biomass can be transferred up the food chain. But in colder ecosystems, all of that is going to be a lot less. Primary production is specifically the accumulation of these carbon compounds as biomass in the autotrophs, or in the producers. Gross primary production, or GPP, is the total biomass that's made from photosynthesis. But then some of that gets used by the actual producer itself. So the net primary production, or NPP, is going to be the gross primary production, how much energy is made in photosynthesis, minus the biomass that is lost due to cellular respiration, because they already used a lot of that for themselves. Therefore, the net primary production is the amount that is available to the consumers at the next trophic level. Primary producers are going to always accumulate the most biomass compared to other trophic levels, because they have to support all the levels above them on the food chain within the food webs. Secondary production is the accumulation of carbon compounds as biomass in heterotrophs. Cellular respiration will always result in a loss of carbon compounds because it's going to use the carbon, the glucose, in cellular respiration, break it down into ATP energy. And remember, all that usage by the organism itself is biomass that cannot be passed on to the next trophic level. So again, we would expect less and less biomass to be able to move up to the next trophic level. So gross primary production is always going to be the most, right? What the plants make per photosynthesis. Net primary production will be less than that because organisms already use some of that for themselves. And then the secondary production will be even less than that. And within secondary production, there'll be less and less of that as you move up the trophic levels. These differences in production can be seen in farm yields. So when farmers are either growing crops or raising cattle, for example, or some other animal, for example, on their farmland, we can analyze how much of their product are they actually creating per that given area per year, or per time, so per year, for example. And the data always supports that we get more product for that same time and same area with plants. So here's a good example right here. For wheat on the bottom right, you can see how much higher that value, that yield value actually is compared to cows. Both of these are used to feed organisms, but for the same area in the same amount of time, we can produce a lot more wheat than we can beef. This would mean that wheat can feed a lot more people within the same space and within the same time frame. And so environmentalists are really interested in this type of study because, you know, plants can actually feed so many more people. And beef is probably going to have one of the lowest numbers. Other animals that are smaller in their body size, they're less expensive to feed and they take up less space, whereas cows need a lot of space because they need to graze all that grassland. And so like for a chicken, for example, its number would be somewhere between beef and wheat. It wouldn't be as low as beef would be. So again, it definitely varies with the farm yield that you're actually talking about. The loss in energy and biomass through the trophic levels is done for a variety of reasons. One, we've already talked about how organisms are going to use most of that energy for themselves in cellular respiration. And so all of that energy that they use to make the ATP is lost, can't be passed on to the next trophic level. And the same for the ATP that's being used by the actual cell to do cellular work. None of that gets passed on to the next trophic level. And both of those processes also generate heat. Heat will be used will be lost when ATP is made and also when ATP is used. None of that gets passed on. Also, a lot of times organisms, when they die, the organism that's consuming them doesn't consume all parts of the organism. For example, when the lion eats the zebra, the lion only eats the meat. It doesn't eat the hair. It doesn't eat the bones, right? And it's going to have leftover tissue that it doesn't eat left on these structures. None of that stuff gets passed on to the lion's level. Instead, it gets passed to the decomposers, right? So they're going to take some of that energy. That results in energy loss in the transferring as well as biomass loss. And then organisms eliminate waste through excretory processes like urination and feces, and that waste does not move up to the next trophic level. Typically, that stuff gets passed to the decomposers or to the soil directly. So because of this loss in both energy and biomass as we move up the trophic levels, there will be strict restrictions put on the number of trophic levels that can be supported in an ecosystem. It's not just endless amounts of these trophic levels. Typically, tertiary consumer could be the end of it, or sometimes there can be quaternary consumers, but there's usually not enough energy left over or mass left over for levels beyond that. This loss of energy in a food chain can be represented by a pyramid of energy. Many diagrams in textbooks will look like this, where you do have this like typical pyramid shape, but some will be more complex. We will draw our diagrams different than this. So you can see, though, it does show that 10% transfer rule. On average, 10% gets transferred to the next trophic level, so less and less energy is available to the next trophic level. What's wrong with drawing it as a triangle is it's not proportional. Like this level is not showing that it's 10% of this level, and so on. So to fix this, IB uses stepped pyramids, where we can draw each step of the pyramid proportionally to the next one. And so we will practice drawing these proportions. And so you would calculate, for example, what proportion is 596 of this value, and then you would create a scale to draw these two to scale. And then you would do the same thing for the next levels, and so on. If you're not given numbers to calculate that proportion, you would assume 10% transfer. And then you would draw the next level, 10% of the size of the level below. And we'll practice this in class. The units are kind of similar to biomass, except for this first portion needs to be a unit of energy. So kJ would be kilojoules, for example. But it's still like an energy unit per an area unit per a time unit. Moving into cycling of chemical elements or nutrients through an ecosystem. Chemical elements are going to be continuously cycled throughout the environment, or between the environment and the living organisms that live there, as they're going to use those nutrients and eliminate any waste. All of this is going to go into nutrient cycling. Nutrients can be inorganic or organic. They can be available or unavailable. Inorganic, remember, means it lacks carbon specifically, but it would also have to lack hydrogen, because organic means it has carbon and some hydrogen. So to be organic, it has to have carbon and hydrogen. For example, carbon dioxide has carbon, but it doesn't have hydrogen. Therefore, it is inorganic. But really the term comes from carbon. Most carbon compounds are organic. So anything inorganic definitely lacks carbon. And then it's going to cycle between inorganic, organic, available, unavailable for the organism by using physical and chemical processes. Physical processes would include like weathering and erosion, where rain or wind can help to loosen up sedimentary rock, releasing nutrients that can go into the soil or waters around it. The burning of fossil fuels is going to release chemicals in the air that can be used as nutrients. Rock formation ties them up, so this is how things can get locked up in rock and become unavailable. And then leaching specifically refers to water, where chemicals can get leached into water, into the soil, and then can make their way into the groundwater. In biological processes would include photosynthesis and cell rest. We've already talked about this extensively and how that relates to certain nutrients like carbon, oxygen, things like that. Assimilation is the uptake or usage of nutrients. For example, plants will uptake or assimilate nitrogen from the soil. Decomposition is when decomposers break them down and return nutrients to the soil. This is going to be a huge part of nutrient cycling. And then excretion is when waste is eliminated by organisms. You don't need to know the details of this picture, but it just kind of shows how things could cycle back and forth between these different forms. For example, if we focus on carbon, we know that carbon dioxide is inorganic, but it's available. That means plants can take it in. They can take it in and use it in photosynthesis and create an organic compound. So now it's organic and available. Then it can be re-released as the inorganic compound through cellular respiration or decomposition. Or it can be locked up in a fossilization process and become coal, oil, or peat. We can then mine for these substances or find these substances and then burn them for fossil fuels, things like that. Okay, so it can go back and forth between all of these things. An essential nutrient is a nutrient that a living organism needs in order to survive. There are lots of essential nutrients, and some are listed on this slide as examples. Nitrogen is an essential nutrient. We need it to make a lot of really important molecules that the body absolutely has to have. For example, we need it to make amino acids and proteins. We need it to make nucleic acids like DNA and RNA. It's found in every nucleotide. ATP is a nucleotide, so we need to make it, or we need to use it to make ATP energy, and so on. Phosphorus is also an essential nutrient. We need it to make a lot of things, such as nucleic acids. Remember, there's a phosphate group in each nucleotide. So that also means we need it for ATP. ATP has a phosphate group. We need it to make phospholipids to build cell membranes, and so on. Carbon is needed to make all of the organic macromolecules. So carbs, proteins, lipids, nucleic acids, all of them contain carbon. All living organisms need carbon, a lot of it. It's an essential nutrient. Decomposers play a key role in making sure these essential nutrients get recycled through the ecosystem. Here's an example of the nitrogen cycle. The details of the nitrogen cycle are not needed, but you should have an understanding in general of how nutrients get cycled. So remember, we talked previously about there being nitrogen in the atmosphere, N2 is the most abundant gas in the atmosphere, but the problem is it's not in a usable form by organisms, and we need a way to get nitrogen to the plants. So therefore, it has to be converted into an available form. There's lots of ways to do this, but a lot of times bacteria are going to be used for that. There's going to be bacteria in the soil that can fix nitrogen and turn it into a usable form, and then the plants can assimilate that nitrogen from the soil. We also talked about a more specific example that uses rhizobium. Rhizobium, remember, is a special bacteria that's in a mutualistic relationship with legumes, which is a family of plants. They live in the nodules of these plants in their roots, and they provide the nitrogen. They fix it from the atmosphere and give it to the legumes. In return, the legumes give it a place to live, as well as carbon compounds that it can use for energy. Once we get the nitrogen to the plants through the chemoautotrophs in the soil or through rhizobium, for example, once we get it to the plants, it's now entered the ecosystem. Plants will use it to build all their important structures, and then the plants will be eaten by the herbivores. Now the herbivores have the nitrogen to use to build for their structures. Once the herbivores get eaten, it continuously passes through the food chain. When any of these organisms die, the decomposers will help to recycle it back to the soil, and then once again return those nutrients to the soil for the plants to use. Therefore, it's a cycle. There's also going to be bacteria that can turn the nitrogen back into N2, and so it can go back into the atmosphere, also contributing to the cycle. Again, you don't really need to know the details of the nitrogen cycle other than this, and then other than it passes through the food chain and decomposers help to cycle it back. The same for the phosphorus cycle. You don't have to know the details, but you should have a general understanding of how phosphorus gets cycled, which is pretty similar to the nitrogen cycle. The major differences is where it comes from initially. We don't get phosphorus from the air, we get it from rock. So sedimentary rock contains large amounts of phosphorus, but we have to wait for processes like weathering and erosion to release it into the soil. Once it's in the soil, the plants can uptake it. Or we can mine for it. We can mine for the rock and remove the phosphorus that way. And then once again, we can give it to the plants, for example, the crops, if we make fertilizer from it. And then now the plants have it and it's entered the ecosystem. Once the plants have it, it passes through the food chain. So all organisms above them on higher trophic levels also have the phosphorus to use. Once they die, it goes back into the soil because of the decomposers. The carbon cycle has a lot of similarities in their processes. Details of the carbon cycle are needed, but we will focus on these other details in an upcoming set of notes. For now, focus on what we've already learned. We know that carbon can enter plants by photosynthesis. They're going to take in the CO2 from the atmosphere, convert it into high energy sugars. Once the plants have it, then now carbon can be passed through the food chain like normal. Carbon can also be returned to the soil through decomposition from the decomposers. Carbon can also be released back into the atmosphere as a waste product of cellular respiration, therefore recycling the carbon. We'll talk a little bit more about how it can become fossilized in an upcoming chapter, and then how it can be used in combustion reactions also in an upcoming chapter. And that's really it for nutrient and energy cycling.